Chapter 5. The Sea Glass Morning. The day began as a quiet pale ribbon along the horizon, the kind of light that asks a person to speak softly even if no one else is awake. And Aiden stirred before his alarm and lay still on his pillow for a moment while the ocean moved in its steady way below the open window, a slow in and out like breathing. The small glass on his sill held the cutting that Mira had given him, and the first root had lengthened since yesterday, a thin bright thread in the clear water that trembled when a breeze passed through the room. He smiled at the sight and felt the same gentle hope he had felt in the greenhouse. Then rose, made a cup of tea, and stood by the window to sip while the sky deepened from gray to soft blue. On the table near the door sat a cloth pouch he had set aside the night before, just big enough to hold small treasures from the shore without making his pockets heavy. Next to it was his sketchbook, a pencil with a calm point, and the little bundle of notes from the cafe tied with ribbon. He touched the bundle once, not to read, only to remember the calm of the board and the candle and the quiet way the town had listened to two people learning the shape of a conversation. There had been a card from Mira yesterday evening that read sunrise on the South Beach. Walk slow, gather only what the sea has finished teaching. And he had answered yes with a small drawing of a wave that touched a pebble and curled away. He left the room with the pouch at his belt and the sketchbook under his arm and stepped into the clean air that had traveled over water all night. The streets were mostly empty. A cat crossed the lane with a look that said it knew every secret of the morning. Windows glowed in a few kitchens where kettles were beginning to sing. He kept a quiet pace and turned toward the pier where the wooden planks creaked in a familiar way. The tide was low enough to leave a bright path along the sand, and the first gulls were already tracing their quick arcs above the foam. At the edge of the pier he saw Mira waiting with a thermos and 2 cups and that calm, awake smile that made the rest of the world ease a little farther away. She wore a sweater the color of faded seagrass and had tucked her hair behind one ear, and morning light placed a thin, simple line along her cheek. "Good morning," she said, and the words felt like warm water over cool glass. He greeted her softly and accepted a cup of tea. They stood for a moment without speaking and watched the slow arrival of the sun over the far line of the water. The light gathered in the small ripples so gently that it looked as if the ocean were remembering something kind. Mira pointed toward the South Beach, and they began their walk together, following a sandy path that ran behind a row of weathered fences and then opened to a long, smooth stretch of shore. The sand was cool under their shoes and gave a small sound where it met the thin lace of each wave. The air held a faint scent of salt and kelp and smooth stone. Aiden felt his breath settle to match the water. Mira carried the thermos in a simple cloth sling, leaving her hands free to point and touch. She told him they would look along the line where the water had paused and then drawn back, where pebbles and shells rested like notes at the end of a sentence, and that the best places were small pockets near driftwood where the sea turned its palm and set down what it no longer needed. "Sea glass," she said, "begins as something careless, A bottle dropped from a boat, a jar tossed away, a broken lamp shade, and the ocean keeps it and tumbles it and teaches it for years until it is ready to return to a hand. We gather only pieces that are fully taught. He liked that way of saying it, and he repeated it in his head so he would remember. They reached the first long pocket of pebbles and crouched. The world narrowed to a close, clean view of stone, shell, and shadow. Aiden had never looked so carefully at this edge between water and land. Every small thing seemed to hold a patient story. Mira picked up a smooth white shape with a rind of frost along both sides and placed it in his palm. "This is from a clear bottle," she said, "and time and sand have softened it so that it looks almost like a small cloud." She found a piece with a green like sea grass held in sunlight and said, "This is from bottles that used to carry mineral water or soda. And in some places it could be as old as the first shop on a street." She held up a bit of brown with a soft curve and said this could be from a bottle that carried medicine or beer. And then a bit of olive with a quiet depth that looked like a dusk inside glass and said this was often used for oil because the color protected what was inside. Aiden turned each piece in his hand slowly, watching how the edges were soft like worn soap and the surfaces had a fine frost that caught light even when the sun hid behind a thin cloud. He asked about other colors and she smiled and said blue was rare and often came from old apothecary bottles or from certain tableware, and that people still felt a thrill when they found cobalt because the sea kept it for a long time. She said red was rarer still and could come from lantern lenses or from tableware that had a touch of gold in the making, and she had never found orange but knew it existed. He asked about lavender, and she said that some old glass had manganese in it to keep it clear, and long years of sunlight could turn it pale violet, and that collectors loved that change because it was like a memory made visible. She spoke with simple care, as if the colors were neighbors whose names she knew by heart, and Aiden felt the warmth of being taught by someone who loved their subject with patience. They began to search together. He learned to keep his eyes soft and to let the glow of a frosted surface call him rather than stare too hard at any one place. He learned to pause just as a wave pulled away, because that brief moment showed many small shapes before the water returned. He learned to lift pieces gently from the sand and to feel with his fingers for sharp edges that meant the lesson of the sea was not yet complete. When he found a fresh shard, he put it back respectfully, and when he found a piece whose edges were kind, he set it in his pouch. They spoke little, and when they did it was only to share a small discovery or to point to a line where the light looked promising. Aiden found a shard of blue no larger than a fingernail, smooth as a worry stone, and Mira laughed softly at the surprise in his voice and told him to keep it for the center of whatever they would make. She found a thick piece of clear glass with letters pressed into it from a long-lost name, and Aiden thought about the way words can survive in fragments and still be beautiful. They carried their finds to a flat rock near a driftwood log and rinsed each piece in a shallow pool. The morning had grown brighter, and the world seemed to pause and watch the way the glass shone on the wet stone. Mira spread the pieces by color so they could see what the sea had decided to give them. There were many whites, a handful of greens in several shades, a good number of browns, two pale aquas, the small cobalt, a single speck of lavender that caught the sun like a secret, and a piece so dark it looked black until she held it to the light and it turned deep green, which she said was called black glass by collectors and came from very old bottles. Aiden sketched the arrangement in his book, labeling each color with small neat letters and noting on the side the way the frost on the glass looked like breath on a window. The drawing was simple and clean, and he liked that it felt like both a record and a thank you note. When he finished, Mira poured tea into the 2 cups and they sat on the driftwood with the sea at their feet. He asked how she had learned so much about these small things. She told him that when she was younger she had walked the shore with her aunt and had kept a jar of found pieces on the sill of her room, and that the collection had been less about the pieces themselves and more about the shared mornings and the feeling that the sea had handed her a story in small safe parts. He said that he had collected pencil shavings as a child because he liked the way the curled wood looked like tiny scrolls, and his grandmother had put them in a jar. And sometimes he opened the lid just to smell cedar and remember the calm of drawing after dinner. She laughed softly at that image and said she could almost smell the cedar herself. They finished the tea and returned to the sand to search again. The sun lifted higher and set a thin glitter across the water like a spill of coins. Gulls cried and then settled. The breeze moved along the shore without hurry. At one point Aiden stepped too close to the lip of a small wave and cold water ran over his shoes and into his socks. He jumped back, and Mira covered her mouth with her hand and then laughed with that soft sound he had grown to look for, the one that was warmer than any sunlight on a cool day. He grinned and said he had needed a quick wake-up, and she said the sea liked to make sure people remembered they were guests. They found a heart-shaped piece of white glass that looked as if it had been waiting for them, and they set it aside on the flat rock like a tiny emblem. They found a heart-shaped piece of white glass that looked as if it had been waiting for them, and they set it aside on the flat rock like a tiny emblem. They found a long, thin piece of green with a smooth curve, and Mira said it would look beautiful as the stem of something if they were to build a frame or a chime. They began to speak of making. At first the talk was small and playful, ideas spoken and then set down like shells. But then Aiden held the green curved piece in his fingers and pictured it moving in a warm draft against a window somewhere. And he said they could make a lantern, perhaps a simple wooden frame with thin clear panes to hold the glass, or a narrow row of strings that would catch afternoon light in the greenhouse. Mira liked the image and added that the pieces could hang by thin wire, and that on quiet evenings the soft click of glass would sound like distant wind moving through a grove of bottles. He drew a little plan with neat lines and a few notes about size and balance. She suggested a second idea, a mosaic circle set into a stepping stone for the path that led to the greenhouse door, a round of smooth concrete with glass pressed into the surface in a pattern of waves, so that visitors would step over a small morning whenever they came. He liked that very much and wrote down both. They promised to keep the plan gentle and to make something when they had gathered enough pieces and when the days ahead allowed them to work without rush. Promise, she said, and he answered promise, and the word felt simple and right. As the morning went on, they met an older man with a straw hat who walked the shore with his hands behind his back. And he nodded to them and said the tide had been generous. Mira knew him by name and asked after his garden. And he said the beans were climbing again and that he placed shells at the base of the stalks to keep the ground bright. He looked at their little spread of colors on the rock and gave a kind whistle and pointed to the cobalt, then wished them a day that would stay easy and moved on at his unhurried pace. Aiden watched him go and felt the steady comfort of living in a place where people had time to notice one another in small ways. The sun climbed to a place where the air warmed their shoulders and the sand began to feel soft on their knees when they knelt. They took a break and walked the edge of the water, letting foam touch their toes and then slip away. Mira told a simple story about a field trip she had led for children last summer, when one boy had brought her a shard with sharp corners and asked if it was ready, and she had explained the test of the pocket, that a piece of sea glass should be soft enough to rest in your pocket with a silk scarf and never tear it. And the boy had carried the shard back to the tide and tossed it in with a small ceremony that made everyone quiet for a minute. Aiden listened and thought about all the ways a person learns what ready means, and he said he liked that the ocean and time worked together as teachers. He told her about a painting class he had taken in the city where the instructor asked them to paint a bowl of fruit in 10 minutes and then again in 2 hours, and how the first painting had more life in it because he had not tried to control every edge, and that he had been trying to paint since then as if he were always in the first 10 minutes while still taking the care of the 2 hours. She said the greenhouse taught a similar thing. If you rush, the plant knows. If you wait too long, you can miss the moment to help. Somewhere between those is the good place. They walked back to their rock and examined the pile they had made through the morning. The pieces looked like a small garden of light, a handful of colors that had belonged to many lives and now belonged to none and to both of them together. They chose a few favorites to carry and tipped the rest back along the sand so someone else could feel this same small joy. After another careful search, Aiden found a piece of pale aqua with a rounded corner and a faint bubble trapped inside, and he held it up so the sun could catch it. Mira came close to see and said that bubble meant the glass had been made in an older way, and that the sea had taken good care of it. He slid the piece into the pouch and felt the weight of the morning take a place inside him where it would stay. They turned slowly toward the pier. The tide had begun to creep back, erasing their footprints with polite efficiency. The town ahead of them grew brighter in the sun and looked as if it had stretched and yawned and was now ready to begin its day. As they walked, they spoke about the notes on the cafe board and how the cards would look beside a small jar of sea glass, and whether they might leave 1 or 2 pieces on the shelf for a child to hold. They decided to bring a small dish to the cafe the next day and to set it near the pen and ink with a card that said pieces that learned from the sea. Please take one and carry it as a gentle thought. Aiden imagined a quiet hand choosing a small white cloud of glass and slipping it into a pocket to rub when the mind needed a calmer pace. Mira liked that idea and said she would press a tiny fern leaf into a card to sit with the dish, so that the sea and the greenhouse would share the space. Back at the pier, they rinsed their hands at a public tap and shook out sand from their shoes, laughing again when a stubborn line of grains clung to the edge of Aiden's sock as if it wanted to come home with him. They sat on a low bench and sorted their pieces once more, this time choosing exactly which ones would be kept for the lantern or the stepping stone. The cobalt would be the center. The pale aqua bubbles would be a small moon. The green curve would be a stem that bent slightly to the right. The heart white would sit at the bottom where the light could warm it. The dark piece that looked black would stand near the edge to anchor all the brightness and make it deeper by contrast. Aiden drew the plan a second time with the actual shapes in mind. Mira leaned close and placed the cup of the thermos near his hand when he paused, and the steam rose in a thin line between the pages of the sketchbook like a bookmark made of warm air. They did not rush to leave. Boats hummed out beyond the breakwater. A dog trotted past with a stick in a purposeful face. A small child pointed at the sparkle of the water and said a sound that was not a word but carried the meaning of joy. The morning had not hurried them and now invited them to carry its mood into the rest of the day. They rose, thanked the shore in their own quiet ways, and walked back into town along the lane that held the smell of fresh bread and fruit. At the door of the cafe, the bell lifted its clear note, and the owner looked up with that knowing smile she wore when life in the room matched well. They ordered simple toast and more tea and chose the small table under the fern where so many of their plans had first found words. Aiden placed the pouch on the table and tipped a few pieces into his open hand so the colors could catch the candle light. And the owner leaned over to see and told them about a jar of old glass her father had kept in the pantry, which she had put in the back room and would bring out if they wished to sift through it later. Myra's eyes brightened and she said yes, please, and Aiden grinned in a way that felt like sunlight on wet sand. They ate their toast, wrote a short card for the future dish, and then walked to the notice board. A single envelope with a small wave in the corner hung from the twine. Mira took it down and handed it to him, and he opened it with careful fingers. Inside lay a card that said, "Sunrise taught me to listen to small light," and a drawing of a flat rock with 2 cups on it, and he felt a gentle warmth lift through his chest. He wrote a reply that said, "I will carry the small light into the day and set it where it can help," and drew the heart white piece in the corner. And Mira read it and pressed her fingers lightly to the cork beside the card, a touch that felt as intimate as any word. The rhythm of the town gathered around them in a friendly way. A neighbor stopped at the counter for bread and smiled at the sight of the glass on the table. A student came in for a muffin and looked at the board as if it were part of the map of home. Outside, the sky had become full day, yet the calm of the morning stayed with them like the scent of salt on a sleeve. They thanked the owner, tucked the pouch and sketchbook away, and stepped back into the lane. Mira had work in the greenhouse for the early afternoon, and Aiden had a commission to plan that involved a small series of illustrations for a local newsletter. And both tasks felt easier because of the kind way the day had begun. At the corner they paused as they often did. They decided to meet in 2 days to begin the simple work of the lantern frame, not to finish anything, only to begin and see how the pieces wished to be arranged. He promised to sand a small board to a gentle smoothness. She promised to bring wire and a tiny hand drill and a list of safe methods for securing glass so it would hang and not crack. He said he liked that there were safe methods, and she laughed and said she had a whole shelf of them. They looked once more at the sea beyond the houses, now bright and confident, and they said goodbye with the kind of goodbye that is really a promise to return. Aiden walked back to his room with the pouch at his belt, making a friendly weight that matched the pull of a long good afternoon. He placed the pouch beside the cutting on the sill so that the little root and the little glass could share the light. He washed the thermos cups and set them to dry. He turned on the record player and let a quiet piano line fill the room, the left hand steady like the tide, the right hand bright like small glass turning in a palm. He opened his sketchbook to the morning map of colors and wrote a few clean notes along the edge, words to help him remember the fragrance of the shore and the first chill of water inside his shoes and the way the sun had found the bubble trapped in aqua and made it look like a captured breath. He closed the book and lay down for a short rest before the afternoon. And when he closed his eyes, he saw the long, calm line of the beach in early light, the two cups on the flat rock, the curve of green that would become a stem in their lantern, and the small blue at the center that would hold the calm of the morning.